I'd love to speak Spanish, but I mean, I can understand, but my is too poor, my Spanish is too poor to give a full lecture.
Buenos días a todos. La verdad es que estoy muy contento porque hace tiempo que llevaba que quería que el profesor Lelli nos pudiera dar un seminario aquí en Madrid. Tengo que agradecer la invitación que le hizo Dagmar Riedel para participar en un congreso sobre profetismo y santidad que va a tener lugar este fin de semana, que organiza ella. Ella es Marie Curie Fellow en el instituto. Y aprovechando que él venía y uniendo fuerzas, que yo creo que eso es lo que se necesita aquí, y eso es lo que pues tenemos como resultado que Fabrizio Lelli va a dar hoy un seminario. Simplemente quiero hacer un par o daros un par de ideas. Probablemente es el especialista más importante que hay ahora mismo en historia intelectual del Renacimiento italiano en relación con los judíos en Italia. Y ha estudiado pues los que son los contactos entre pensadores cristianos, intelectuales cristianos e intelectuales judíos durante el siglo XV. Ha publicado varios libros, de los cuales ha editado varios, resultado de congresos, y aquí os traigo algunos. Concretamente este es el último que ha salido, Humanismo y cultura hebrea y cultura judía en el Renacimiento italiano, un coloquio que tuvo lugar en Florencia hace unos años. Giovanni Pico y la Cábala, es un experto también en Giovanni Pico de la Mirandola y los contactos Johanan Alemano también. Eliade Genesano, que es uno de los pensadores judíos italianos de comienzos del siglo XVI más importante también, y de hecho Fabrizio Lelli tradujo uno de sus obras, Igeret Hamudot. También organizó un congreso sobre los judíos en el sur de Italia, en la zona de la Apulia, en los Biblioteca Salento, entre los siglos IX y XVI. Y aquí tenéis dos separatas que tengo suyas de hace tiempo. Pero yo creo que es la referencia hoy en día en historia intelectual y contactos entre intelectuales judíos e intelectuales cristianos en la península italiana. Concretamente también tiene varios estudios sobre contactos entre intelectuales judíos portugueses e intelectuales judíos italianos en el siglo XV, comienzos del siglo XVI, con la figura de Abravanel, que es uno de los que en el centro. Es profesor en la Universidad de Salento, en Lecce, en el sur de Italia. Y bueno, con esto yo no quiero tomar más del tiempo de él, y la verdad es que estoy muy contento de que pueda hoy estar aquí y dar el seminario, ¿no?
Muchas gracias, Javier. Gracias porque me encuentro aquí. I'm very honored to be here, and I will switch to English. So, of course, if you have questions, any questions you may have, you can ask both in English or Spanish or Italian, whatever you feel like. You will see in the seminar, which I sort of prepared in the last few weeks, after agreeing with Javier about this mission, I'm sort of merging two different aspects of my research. One is related to the study of manuscripts, of Hebrew manuscripts, especially those compiled and copied in southern Italy, and especially in the area of Lecce, in the area of Salento, where I teach. And at the same time, I'm dealing with a sort of genealogical history of Jewish families in the same area. So my point, and I hope it will show from my presentation, is to demonstrate that there's a sort of ongoing Sephardic legacy in the south of Italy, which is related to those families which I'll be dealing with, coming mostly from northern Spain, from Catalonia and from southern France, and that throughout the 15th century particularly, those families kept producing a very significant cultural material which had its roots in Sephardi culture, of course, but was also related to contemporary non-Jewish culture from the area. So that's my point. I mean, depending on where those people happened to be, they were absorbing motifs, traditions from the external areas, meaning both Jewish and non-Jewish, but keeping a very strong, following their own tradition, their own cultural tradition, which is very important to them, as I hope I will demonstrate, and probably it's no secret to you. So I will be dealing first with the idea of medical studies in Italy, because, as my title shows, those intellectuals, the scholars, were mostly physicians, medical doctors. And you might be familiar with this idea. The profession of medical doctor was one of the most prominent among European Jews during the Middle Ages, you know fairly well. And Jews were generally unable to gain access to universities due to religious restrictions. And this is very important, you will see from my point, they had to rely on private initiative or family relationships in order to prepare for examinations so that they could be certified by civil authorities. In most cases, the profession was handed down from father to son, and Jews could therefore qualify privately under the guidance of a practicing physician. However, some major centers of medical education allowed Jews to study medicine there. In a few cases, talented Jewish physicians were granted a specific license by local authorities to practice their profession outside the communities. Such is the case, for instance, of the renowned physician and philosopher Avram the Balmeth. You might be familiar with two Abrahams, the one who is called the elder and the younger. This is the younger. They both were born in Lecce, so just to locate the place, I'm pretty much sure you know that sometimes I'm presenting the results of my research in the United States or somewhere else, and they hardly know where Lecce is, of course. But I'm pretty much sure that you know where it is. So the two major centers, of course, of this phenomenon were Naples, for obvious reasons, because this was the capital of the Kingdom of Naples in the 15th century, and Lecce, which is on the other shore, the Adriatic shore in the Salento area, the Salento Peninsula. So both Abraham the elder and the younger, both of them were physicians, both were from Lecce. Abraham the younger was born in around 1460, and he was the son of a very important physician, Moshe ben Avraham the Balmeth, who later, by coincidence, converted to Christianity. And he was the grandson of this Abraham the elder, whom we will find later on in our survey, in our overview. Both Abrahams were very, very, very famous physicians, and this is particularly striking for me, at least. You might be familiar with something different, but this is, to my knowledge, one of the very few cases of an extant certificate dating to 1492, exactly 1492, from Naples. And you see that the Chancellor Jacopo Caracciolo of the Kingdom of Naples acknowledge and bestow on Abraham de Balmes all powers from the Pope to heal both Jewish and non-Jewish patients, which was very rare at the moment. Anyway, it was not only the experienced teachers and the practical training that made a Jewish doctor. Physicians had to be provided with theoretical basis that could be found in medical authoritative sources. The major corpora of medical knowledge in the Middle Ages were mainly the Greco-Latin and the Greco-Arabic ones, To the classical authorities we should add the contributions of the Western European science, especially those associated with the main medical schools, above all Salerno, in the early Middle Ages, Bologna, Padua, Montpellier and Oxford. However, Jewish doctors had to face the extraordinary lack of medical treatises originally composed in Hebrew by providing new translations from various languages into Hebrew, especially of the major medical handbooks. It is then understandable why the history of the Hebrew language and its service to Jewish medicine during the High and Late Middle Ages is, in essence, the story of the effort to translate a complete scientific library from Arabic into Hebrew and later from Latin into Hebrew. To this core of medical encyclopedias and of treatises on more specific medical issues, we should add other books of science, which were then closely connected to the study of medicine, treatises on astronomy or astrology, as well as texts on other natural sciences, among which we should include both disciplines that still today are considered scientific and disciplines that are now called, often, in my opinion, erroneously, pseudo-sciences such as alchemy, for instance, or geomancy, or books on the magical properties of stones and plants, for instance. Medical doctors had to know the science of the stars, to forecast the better time for starting their therapies, and this is the reason why they were so knowledgeable about astronomy, to understand the origin of a disease and the more appropriate moment for preparing or applying a medicament. Thus, one of the major concerns for a Jewish and also for a non-Jewish physician was that of collecting a library by buying manuscripts from others, by commissioning copies, and by translating or transcribing those texts for themselves. In this major framework, we should also take into account the ongoing mobility of the Jews in the Middle Ages and the early modern era throughout Central and Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean area. The mobility of Jewish scholars made those intellectuals especially skilled in acquiring new language competences, which allowed them to translate works composed in different languages and to make them available for other cultural areas. We should also consider the well-documented attitude of Jewish scholars to bring with them, in their wanderings, their intellectual heritage in the forms of manuscripts, as well as their awareness of contemporary scientific developments in their intellectual environments outside their religious communities. In other words, Jewish physical mobility was also responsible for Jewish intellectual mobility. So here I will be dealing with Jewish circulation of scientific material in the late Middle Ages, particularly in the 15th century, and I will mainly focus on the area of southern Italy, and especially Apulia, Salento, the southern part of Apulia. This is a very old geographic map of the most important centers of medical knowledge in medieval Europe. And I will start my survey taking into account a family of doctors who most probably were of Sephardi origin, although they might, we don't have any certainty about that, but I'm pretty much sure it was this way. If you want, I can tell you, wow, though this is not the subject of my lecture today. But anyway, this was a family that was deeply rooted in the Byzantine world. And like many other Jewish families, starting at the turn of the 15th century, they moved to the Adriatic shore of Italy for several reasons. And I enjoyed myself very much in reconstructing 3 generations of this family. And this is the ancestor, the first person whom we know about from manuscripts he copied starting from the end of the 14th century in an area that is located between southern Apulia, Salento area, and Valona, present-day Albania. Okay, so you have an idea of this mobility across the Adriatic Sea and across different areas of the Jewish diaspora. So, the first person whom we know about is this Elijah ben David ibn Shoham. I must be honest that I'm following 19th century sources, I mean reference sources. He's generally referred to as Ibn Shoham. But I'm more and more inclined to think that he could be Evr Shoham, meaning that instead of thinking of Ibn Shoham, this could have been a nickname or something like Evr Shoham, the stone of I don't know what you call it, diaspora, one of the stones of the priestly pectoral, the priestly ornament, you know, which was, and this I'm discovering more and more, particularly in the Byzantine Empire, one of the major ways to define a very important wise person within a Jewish community. So just to give him an important title of honor, his coreligionists were calling him the stone of sapphire, for instance, the stone of diaspora, something like that. And as a matter of fact, the name, which became popular, particularly I think in the Byzantine and then Ottoman Empire, just was Shoham, not Ibn Shoham, which of course would have come through Arabic or through an Arabic Sephardic word or something like that, was just Shoham, which was just a nickname. And I think this is possible because this Eliyahu ben David has had 2 different nicknames, Ibn or Evr Shoham and Nezer Zahav. And about Nezer Zahav there's no doubt. I mean, this is a nickname. I mean, he was the honor, he was the crown, I mean, the golden something, I mean, the golden ornament of his generation or something like that, which was very popular again among Byzantine Jews. So this is the reason, one of the reasons why I'm holding that they, even if they probably came from Sfarad, they had lived for a long time in Byzantium. And we also know that this Elijah or Eliyahu was the son of another David, who was also called Amelamed, the teacher. So this is also important to my knowledge because we don't know whether this guy was a real teacher, an actual teacher, but we know that Eliyahu was a teacher himself, because in his wanderings around Apulia, he was mostly copying handbooks, Hebrew material for academic or didactic education, you know. And we know that in early 15th century Apulia, there were many schools, there were many Jewish schools operating in the area of Bari, Bitonto, Otranto, and many people, especially those coming from the Sephardic world, and ended up studying Sephardic culture. So for those people, I guess, we don't have anything before the second half of the 15th century hinting at this specific kind of education, but we know that the schools existed because we have exchanges of letters already in the first half of the 15th century among Jewish scholars and Jewish and non-Jewish scholars working in Italy, who attest to the presence of those academies. Sephardi, they're called Sephardi academies in Apulia, in Puglia. So I imagine that, I guess that they needed handbooks, they needed books, they needed sorts of things. And we have a relatively large, like 6 or 7 manuscripts copied by this Eliyahu ben David, and by chance, because we may guess that he had copied much more than that, and that most of his production probably was lost. It's a real luck that we have those texts, mostly kept in Vienna and in Eastern European libraries. This is also another very interesting story. Anyway, so most of those manuscripts contain selections of, I would call them practical works, aiming at daily education. So an overview of astronomy, an overview of homiletics, an overview of medicine, nothing very deep, but something which was probably addressed to students. And so I guess that one of the reasons why these people were also moving so much around these communities, and we find them in different places, was that they were hired by local communities to teach students. Okay? So this was the father, let's say so, or the grandfather, as we will see later. And David ben Elijah was his son, and this one was a physician for sure. We don't know about Elijah. We don't know whether Elijah was himself a physician, but David was. And what is interesting is that one of the manuscripts copied by Elijah was, as I was telling you before, a sort of selections of medical treatises, and in the colophon, Elijah says, I copied these selections of treatises for my son, meaning that what I was telling you at the beginning of my seminar, they were handing down a sort of medical practice from generation into generation, and so this David needed such an education in order to become a physician himself. And he became a physician, and we have 2 beautiful manuscripts copied by this David. And both of them are kept today in the Vienna National Library. So one of the 2 manuscripts is this collections of mathematical and astronomical scientific works, the most important of which is Levi ben Abraham Leviathan, but there are other works in this miscellaneous manuscript, and you can see that in the text you can also find sort of very naive illuminations which were made by David himself. And this is also interesting because Elijah's, his father's manuscripts were also illuminated in the same style. So it is obvious that Elijah taught his son to copy and to illuminate manuscripts for his own usage. So this is very interesting because it's something that you don't find that much in the non-Jewish world, A very important physician generally hires a talented copyist because he can afford it, and he doesn't have the time to copy a very rich, very ornate, decorated copy for himself. Whereas in the Jewish milieus, it was very common to have very beautifully and very decorated, very beautifully ornate texts done for their own usage, meaning that among the tasks of the Jewish education, among the subjects learned by Jewish students, copywriting and decorating, if possible, were among the subjects, of course, of that kind of education. So this is the other manuscript which we still own at the National Library in Vienna, copied by David Ibn or Evan Shoham. And this is also very interesting because this is a selection of Albucasis, of course the Hebrew medieval translation, partial medieval translation of Albucasis. This translation was made by Meshulam Ben Yonah in Provence, and it was called Sefer HaChefetz HaShalem. And this is also a very interesting subject from my point of view, because the reason why Albucasis was very much popular among Jews, especially still in the late Middle Ages, although it was an early Middle Ages medieval medical encyclopedia, the Arabic one, I mean, was that it's mostly centered on surgery. So it was very important for surgeons. And you might be familiar with Avicenna. You know that Avicenna was the most important and the most valuable and the most praised medical text throughout the Middle Ages and even after the Middle Ages. But what is interesting and striking is that from extant manuscripts copied in Apulia and in southern Italy that we still own today, Albucasis was much more favored than Avicenna. So this is also interesting in my opinion, because from what I can say is that it's very warm. Allow me to take off my jacket. I'm not used to this calefacción, really. So the difference between what I may say northern and southern Italy is that probably because of the different education in both Jewish and non-Jewish worlds in northern and southern Italy, you have a trend of copying a lot of Avicenna in northern Italy, and you don't copy Albucasis in northern Italy, whereas you don't copy Avicenna, or very little, in southern Italy, or only specific parts of Avicenna, and whereas you copy a lot of Albucasis in southern Italy. In my opinion, Avicenna is mostly copied in an environment where you define yourself as a sort of philosopher-physician. You know, a physician which is also talented as a philosopher, a person who has very rich, a mentality, an attitude to sciences which are more philosophical and so theoretical. Whereas, in my opinion, since physicians in southern, particularly Jewish physicians in southern Italy, as we know them, were really practicing their discipline, they needed something much more practical, and Albucasis was much more practical. And so, in addition to this hypothesis, this is the only copy of Albucasis which was copied in southern Italy, which has drawings, which has these illuminations made by the same David. And those illuminations are evidently made for practical reasons. He wants to show what parts of the body are attained by specific disease, and why, how you make bloodletting, for instance, or how you cut a specific vein or whatever. So it's very practical. It's very practical. So remember this special popularity, familiarity with Albucasis, because it will we will deal with that later on. Okay? Just remember that I think we have like 10 extant copies of sections of Al-Bukas's version, Hebrew versions extant today in manuscripts. 6 out of the 10, something like that, were produced in Puglia. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting. So it gives you the feeling of this popularity, of this familiarity with this specific text. Okay? I'm skipping some details, but I want to show you some more illuminations. They're very, very naive but very nice. Very, very nice. And look at the beauty of the writing. It's a very interesting writing also from the point of view of the handwriting, because it's something merging a Sephardic hand with a Byzantine hand. So again, this leads me to think that this was a family coming from Sepharad, who knows how and when, and then passing to Puglia through the Byzantine world. So it's very interesting. So this is the colophon of the Al-Bukasis by David Ben-Eliyahu, and it's very interesting because he says that he copied this manuscript in a very, very small village south of Lecce. The only trace of a Jewish community, whatever it was, in the 15th century. Of doubt there was a community there. I think he was there just as a physician. I mean, he had been probably hired by the local noble family, because most of the noble families in southern Italy and probably elsewhere were hiring Jewish physicians for healing themselves. So probably, and they were moving from a city to a different city depending on the needs. So this is where Specchia, this place, is located in far southern Salento. So we don't know, as I was telling you before, we don't know enough about this Ibn or Ibn Shoham, whatever they were called, family. Whether they were from Spain, whether they were from Byzantium. They certainly had come to Puglia from Byzantium, but we don't know anything from before. On the contrary, we know a lot on other physicians who came from Catalonia to southern Italy and to Puglia. As a matter of fact, and this I'm pretty much sure you're much more familiar than me, after the 1391 upheavals against Catalonian Jews especially, many intellectuals accepted invitations of other communities or princes of distant countries and moved to there. One of their favorite destinations was southern Italy, where they were eagerly requested for their intellectual competencies and were granted protection by the local rulers. In addition, the language spoken in southern Italy was very similar to Catalan or Provençal, and this is also very important. So they were, just thinking of what I previously said, we may imagine that, and we will give some examples of some itineraries of these Jewish people from Catalonia to Provence to southern Italy. But what interests me is that they had received an education while still in the Iberian Peninsula, and so they were bringing with them this kind of education into southern Italy. So this is very important. Now, Now let's move to my manuscript. We'll be dealing with this manuscript. This is, in my opinion, this is a very interesting miscellaneous manuscript. I had the possibility to see it from live in St. Petersburg, and it's a very interesting collection of medical texts. And it's partly dated because the first quire of this collection is dated 1466. And the name of the copyist is known because he signs with his name. And this is this very well-known Yeshua Cohen, who was a Sephardi scribe working in Apulia. Most of the Hebrew manuscripts that we still have nowadays were copied by this Yeshua Cohen around the mid-15th century. And most, not to say all, of the manuscripts copied by this Yeshua Cohen were made upon request of Avram the Balmes the Elder. So Avram the Balmes the Elder could afford a specific scribe, a copyist, to copy his own medical, scientific, mostly, manuscripts. In this case, we do not know if this first quire of the manuscript copied by Yeshua Cohen was made for Avram the Balmes, because it doesn't say anything. So, let's see what happens. As you see from a first glimpse on the contents of the manuscript, you can see different medical treatises. For instance, you have this Shaya Shuv, which is again practical gynecological treatments. Okay, very popular, a very popular treatise. Okay. And then you have Adibu Beyenot, which, as you see, was a Provençal Hebrew translation of Arnaud de Villanova, which again was very popular. And then, and this to me is much more important, you have this, I'm sorry for, you can't see the diacritic signs, but you can understand them. Bechinat Abesamim, the exam of fragrances, which was the most important treatise on besamim, on spices, okay? So on herbs, medical herbs, how to use medical herbs for treating diseases and so on and so forth. But what is interesting is that this treatise was written by this Saladino Ferro d'Ascoli. Saladino Ferro d'Ascoli wrote this Compendium Aromatariorum, which became, in a very short time, the most important handbook for herbs in medical schools all around Italy and also outside of Italy. Still in the 16th century, all physicians, all medical doctors going to university would have studied Saladino Ferro's Compendium Aromatariorum. As you see, this is one of the first editions, printed editions of the compendium, dating 1488, so it's a very early edition of this text, which was immediately requested all around for his peculiarities and for his precision and so on and so forth. Now, the name Saladino Ferro is a very strange name, because of course Saladino seems to be somehow Arabic or something like that, but Ferro, you may know, was very common among Jews, particularly in southern Italy. And you still have a lot of Ferro families in Corfu. Nowadays, all Jewish families all families called Ferro to this day in Corfu are Jews. So
Saladin was a Jewish name in Catalonia.
So you see, so I didn't know. How did I know?
Rabbi. This is the Christian name of a rabbi. because rabbis in Catalonia have Christian and
So,
Jewish names.
I'd like to know more about this, because that's my assumption.
Ferro in Spain, also in Spain, both in Castilla and Aragon,
As
in different forms. I mean, you have the surname of the Jews, Ferruciel, Ferro, Fierro. Also, so that it's not it's very but Saladin is very common in Catalonia.
So this I didn't know, and I'm very thank you very much, because I'd like to know more. I will write it somewhere, because there is a big argument among science historians, also in Israel, who've been dealing with Saladino Ferro, and most of them say no, he was no convert because he didn't know Hebrew supposedly, and so people think either he was a convert or he was no Jew. I mean, but Saladino is certainly not a Christian name, Saladino. And Pharaoh, you rarely found this name among Christians in southern Italy. And on the other hand, he was mostly referred to as Saladino d'Ascoli. D'Ascoli because probably his family was from Ascoli, which had a very important Jewish community, of course.
Sorry to interrupt you, but in fact there is a rabbi called Ferrer Saladin.
So.
In early 15th century Aragon, Catalonia.
In early 15th century? So, no. And this is also, that's very interesting, because I will show you the case of a person who comes from Catalonia, who converts and then goes back to Judaism in the area of Ascoli. And then goes to, we will see that. That's very interesting and matches with my point. So if you provide information, I would be grateful. Anyway, this is very interesting. Very interesting. Because Saladino d'Ascoli became the personal apothecary, pharmacist of the Prince of Taranto. Who was the Prince of Taranto? In the early 15th century, this area, which you see in violet, in purple color, was ruled by a very powerful family, the Orsini del Balzo, which were related to the popes, to the Orsini family in Rome, and so on. Whereas del Balzo was a family of Provençal origin who had come to southern Italy with the Anjou in the 13th century. When the Anjou had conquered southern Italy, the kingdom of Naples, del Balzo del Beau, the original name was del Beau, had come with the Anjou, and had become one of the most important families in the kingdom. And throughout the century, they had acquired this very significant area, and most of Apulia was under their rule. For very complicated reasons, they made a very ambiguous politics towards the royal family, the Anjou family. On one hand, they declared they were supportive to the family. On the other hand, they were fighting against the family in order to acquire more power. And they were practicing a sort of parallel cultural policy, which is very much interesting for me, because as the Neapolitan court was hiring Jewish physicians and scholars and people in Naples, they were hiring Jewish physicians and people in Puglia. And all of their physicians were Jewish. And so the Prince of Taranto, who became a very, very important family, so important that then the Alfonso of Aragon, King of Naples, decided to kill him, this Prince of Taranto, because he was too powerful. And you know that there were a lot of struggles for power in the Aragon period, and so one of the first persons who was executed by order upon request of the king was this Prince of Taranto. Anyway, this Prince of Taranto had among his Jewish physicians this Saladino, among his physicians this Saladino Ferro. So this is very important, because in this miscellaneous treatise, we find a translation into Hebrew of the compendium by Saldino Ferro made by this Jacob Yaakov Acohen Belinfante. And you know that Belinfante is the translation of Tov Elem. Okay? And he certainly was from Catalonia, and he was one of the most distinguished Sephardi doctors working in Bari for the Prince of Taranto. So, my theory is that this translation was made by Belinfante out of the text provided to him by Saladino himself, because they were working at the same time for the same person in the same place. So I think they were knowing each other. And what interests me is that the person who collected this miscellaneous material was pretty much familiar with this material, because the person who collected the material, was part of this milieu. Okay? Okay. Then, let's move on. Then we have, again, Abulcasis. Okay? But you may remember that the book copied by David ibn Shoham was titled Sefer HaChefetz HaShalem. Whereas here, the book is called Mesharet Arufim, the servant of physicians, okay? Which is the minister of the physicians, which is the Hebrew translation of the Latin title of the translation from Arabic. So, how come? I mean, why the person who collected the material decided to insert a section from Abulcasis' work, which was a Hebrew translation from Latin, not the original Provençal Hebrew translation? And we will see why. Okay, so let's keep the secret for the time being. Okay? I just want to remark that this was the translation from Latin made by this Azaria ben Yosef Bonfil, another Catalan guy. Okay?
Abamari. Isn't Abamari?
He was called, I will tell you, he was called Bonafus Bonfil. Yeah, Astruk, exactly.
The translator of the translation.
Absolutely, yeah, the same guy. So, and then we have lists of remedies with marginal notes in Judeo-Arabic, and then we have medical lists, again, glossary, Italian, Latin, and Hebrew words. And then another section of the same Mesharet Arufim, the same translation, Hebrew into Latin, Latin into Hebrew, sorry. And then again, medical remedies in Hebrew. And then the last treatise is the only so far known extant treatise written by Abraham the Balmes the Elder, which is a tzah, an advice, a counsel against plague. Okay? And this is also very interesting because this was one of the most interesting subjects of debate at the court of the Prince of Taranto, meaning that since epidemics of plague were very frequent, especially in Apulia, in the early 15th century, the Prince of Taranto decided to make sort of preventive medicine by relying on both Christian and non-Christian physicians, and he pushed them to write treatises in both Latin and in this case Hebrew on the plague, on how to prevent plague, okay? Which is very unique. We have a lot of treatises in Latin, in Italian, and in this case in Hebrew, written in the same period at the court of the Prince of Taranto. And since the author is Avram the Balmes, and there is a note of ownership of a Moshe the Balmes, who probably was the son of Avram the Balmes and the father of Avram the Balmes the younger. I think that Avram the Balmes was the person who collected the manuscript. All the more so, since this council on Prague was written, it said, for this Azariah Bonfil. And Azariah Bonfil is the one who translated the Abulkas' treatise from Latin into Hebrew. So it's evident that it's something which takes place between Bari and Lecce in Puglia in the 15th century, in the mid-15th century, and it's related to the most important families of physicians, the Bellinfante, and we know that a daughter of the of this Jacob Bellinfante got married to a son of Avram the Balmes. So there were a lot of family connections and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting. It's not possible to say for sure this was made by Avram the Balmes, but we know that Yeshua Cohen, who copied the first choir, worked for Avram the Balmes in Lecce. We know that Avram the Balmes wrote this last treatise. We know that the treatise was addressed to Azariah Bonfil, and we have two parts of Azariah Bonfil's work on Abulkas' translation. So it's exactly a perfect depiction of what they were doing in Puglia. And following what I was telling you at the beginning, all of these things are very practical. It's a sort of collection of practical counsels, remedies, recipes, prescriptions. Everything is very practical. Okay?
Yeah, I have a question, because we don't see the manuscript. So, are the sources in the text? I mean, they cite the sources, or they are mixed up?
No, it's this way. I mean,
it's like it's pronounced. This is from.
No, it's
okay.
Of course,
okay.
because this was very important to them, because they were not, in my opinion, they were not like today. I would say. I mean, a physician, a medical doctor, is not a philologist in principle.
No, yeah.
They are mostly interested in the value of the text for practical reasons.
Yeah,
so. The important is that this text is attributed to Abulkasis, for instance. So as long as the text is by Abulkasis, it's important.
That's why.
So the title says, explicitly states, this is this and this is that. But in my opinion, is important is that they belong, I mean, there are different handwritings, so it's a collection of notebooks, that most of that were probably copies made in the family or in the environment or in the milieu at a certain moment, either by Avram himself or his son, could have been the son, Moses, but collected something from his father's library. Who knows? I mean, because it's exactly the period when Avram should have been very old, that Moses would be in his best period, you know. So we don't know enough, but we know that certainly this manuscript in St. Petersburg, now today in St. Petersburg, was copied in Apulia at some point in the mid-15th century, after the mid-15th century, and that the owner certainly was a doctor of Catalan possibly origin, belonging to this milieu of Sephardi doctors working there for the princes of Taranto. Okay, so this is very peculiar. This is very important. Okay, so this is, for instance, another medical miscellany copied by this Yeshua Cohen, which I was telling you about. By mere chance, this was copied for a member of the Shocham family. So it's the same people working in the same milieu. Okay. Now, let's come to this Azaria ben Yosef von Fiel, because, I mean, Javier certainly knows everything about this guy, but in my opinion, this is an extraordinary story. Because, and I think that the story of Azaria von Fiel was very similar, might be similar to Saladino Ferrer's, if we managed to find out that he was coming from Catalonia. But we know everything in a certain way of Azaria von Fiel, because we know that Azaria was the son of Joseph von Fiel, a Struk. He was born in Catalonia at some time in the 1380s. His family was very wealthy, they were moneylenders. And at a certain moment, at some point, they decided to leave for Perpignan. So they went to Perpignan, and possibly following the mass conversions that took place in the aftermath of the Tortosa disputations in 1414, this Azaria von Fiel converted, was baptized around 1415, along with his wife and two sons, okay, male children. And he took a Christian name. We have his Christian name. He was called Gabriel Catella. Okay? And we have a lot of documents in the Provençal archives related to his being a very talented doctor. Okay? But in 1418, we don't know why, he decided to quit Perpignan, and he later moved to northern Italy. That's also interesting because it gives you an idea what happened very frequently. He left his wife behind and one of his sons behind, who kept being Christians. And they are still found in local archives as Christians until the 1430s. Okay? Whereas he brought the other son with him to Italy, and at some point in the Marche region, Macerata, where you see Macerata Feltre, under the protection of Carlo Malatesta, he decided to go back to Judaism and his son with him, and he took his former name Azaria. And in 1423, he translated Boethius, the Consolazione Philosophiae, into Hebrew. It's very interesting. Why? Why turning Boethius into Hebrew? But it gives you the idea. It's a medical doctor. He had been obliged to conversion. He spoke Latin. I mean, he could deal with Latin texts, of course, because he was a doctor, because he had been obliged to conversion. Now, by going back to Judaism, he wants to show that his language, I mean, his official language is Hebrew in some way, and all of the texts he's dealing with have to be translated into Hebrew. So even Boethius, the Consolazione Philosophiae, has to be turned into Hebrew. Then, we don't know why, in 1429, we found him in Senise, which is a very, very small, tiny village up on the mountains in the Basilicata region, close to Puglia, let's say Puglia. And not by chance, Senise was a fief of the Orsini del Balzo family. Okay? And in 1429, we know that because in 1429, he translated Abulcas's Latin translation of the medical encyclopedia, okay, into Hebrew. Why? Because he said that in the introduction to his translation, because he said that he wanted to provide his son with necessary education for him to become a talented physician. but he couldn't find, while in Senise, a medical, a Hebrew translation of the text, which according to him was the most important text for surgery. And while visiting the library of a Christian doctor, he names the doctor Luis. He says, while visiting the library of this doctor, I found a copy of the Latin translation of Abulcasis, and I decided to make a new translation of this Latin text for my son. And in the introduction, he praises the Prince of Taranto, this Giovanni Antonio del Balza, whom we mentioned earlier, for rescuing him from the Inquisition, from the inquisitorial Dominican friars who were ravaging all around the kingdom of Naples. But the Prince of Taranto, this is well known, was saving, rescuing Jewish physicians especially, who had been Christians and then went back to Judaism, and who were attacked by the Dominican friars for having been Christians, of course. And it's so beautiful if you read the introduction, the Hebrew introduction of Azariah's translation of Abulcasis' text, because he says in a very biblical, poetic style, I thank you, the Prince of Taranto, for rescuing me from these wild goats, he says. You know, these very wild goats who are attacking even these mountains in order to purify their environment. But thanks to the great policy of the Prince of Taranto, I was rescued and I could be freed from them, and so on and so forth. It's very mysterious, because of course he can't hint directly at the persons, you know, he can't quote their names, he can't make their names, but he evidently has some persons in mind. So this is very interesting. It's a very interesting thing. So, to conclude, in my opinion, what we have in this miscellany of St. Petersburg now today held in St. Petersburg is an example, is a perfect example of the medical scientific dynamics among doctors, medical doctors working in Apulia, and especially those working in the milieu of the Prince of Taranto, of the Orsini del Balzo family. And we see a lot of features that may be ascribed to all of them. Most of these doctors were originally born or came from Catalonia. They had come to southern Italy through Provence. Some of them had been obliged to conversions. Some of them, most of them, actually all of them, were Jewish now, back to Judaism, although we don't know enough about Saladino Ferro, who certainly didn't go back to Judaism, if he ever was Jewish. And we have an idea of their practical goals, of their education, of their interests. And we know also the way they were working. I mean, they were acquiring material from other colleagues, and they were exchanging those materials in order to work on them. Okay? If they couldn't find what they were looking for, they could address a non-Jewish doctor, as was the case of Azaria Bonfil, and they could make their own translations from Latin into Hebrew for what they were interested in. So here I just added something which belongs to a later period, just to give you the connecting link with a period when, unfortunately, for reasons that you may easily understand. At the very end of the 15th century, most of these Sephardi families had to leave Apulia, and one of the most important families that we find probably from Provence is the family of Kalonymos, who intermarried with the Balmes family and decided to go to Venice. And in the 16th century, all of these families are found in Venice. And all of these families became part of the industry of print, or the printing industry, which became very popular and important in Venice. And one of the members of this Kalonymos families, David ben Kalonymos, became one of the most important proof correctors of the Bomber printing press. And it's very interesting to see how those families have been very talented physicians, doctors, and collectors of manuscripts in southern Apulia. And it's also very interesting for me, especially, to find out where their books ended up being. In Vienna, for instance, in St. Petersburg, in Breslov, in Warsaw, in all places, and I guess in Constantinople, who knows, but we don't have evidence, of course, because all of their legacy was lost there, you know. I imagine that the reason why we have this very beautiful miscellany in St. Petersburg belonging to the Firkovich collection is that Firkovich himself bought it from Crimea or some other place from the Ottoman Empire and brought it to St. Petersburg in the 19th century. We don't have any historical extant trace in the archives of the St. Petersburg National Library, but still, it's possible, it's likely to be this way. That's it. I don't know, I put together many things, maybe too many things, but the idea is just to give you glimpses of what I'm doing, what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to... my goal is mainly to give the feeling that in a region where you do not have Jews any longer, because compared to northern Italy, where you have an ongoing presence of Jews throughout centuries, Puglia, like most of southern Italy, like Spain, like Portugal, you don't have Jews in the case of southern Italy, from the 16th century, from the mid-16th century. But we may say that immediately after the expulsion from Spain, although some of them went to southern Italy, then they immediately left. Also because the situation was not favorable to them, the economic situation was very poor, they didn't have much to do there, and so most of them left either for the Ottoman Empire, for Venice, or some other places. And already at the beginning of the 16th century, even if in theory they could have stayed, they left. And now, after 5-6 centuries, you don't find anything left. And it's amazing to see how many things they did in the 15th century, throughout this 15th century, how important they were in the 15th century. And from archival documents, you see how many properties they had in Lecce, in Bari, what they did there on practical purposes, and what the extent of their exchanges, of their intellectual exchanges, even with the non-Jewish population. You see, and all of a sudden, all this disappeared. So I'm trying to prove that, because today it's very difficult, because you go there, and also for practical reasons, because the city of Lecce, since the conquest, the Spanish conquest, the city of Lecce, especially in the period of Charles V, was totally renovated in a Spanish style way. So even the style, the architecture style, everything is new. So all the Middle Ages, all the medieval traces in Lecce are erased. So it's very interesting, you know. You don't find evidence of this medieval past. like in any other place in Italy. Even in Sicily, you find much more evidence than in southern Puglia. So that's basically it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your patience.
This is the end of the first part of the seminar. Now we go to the second part of the seminar. So comments and questions. I have a list of questions and comments.
Of course,
Let
please.
people maybe first ask you or comment anything, and then I will start shooting.
Shooting, okay. I'll be
If
pleased.
you have any question, even Spanish, this is easier for you, so you can speak in Spanish.
So thank you for your exposition. First of all, I think it was great. I would like to ask you about those Puglia handbooks for Jewish teaching or Jewish scholar that you talk about. There was Kabbalistic knowledge in this book. You know that?
So I shall answer each question. Okay. I'm very fond of Kabbalah and the reception of Kabbalah in Italy. Unfortunately, so far, I haven't found any Kabbalistic trace here in Puglia. That's very interesting. Although Abraham the Baptist the Younger wrote a Kabbalistic treatise, I'm pretty much sure that they were knowledgeable about Kabbalah, but they didn't want to deal with Kabbalah. And this is what you still find in later generations in Venice. I mean, the following generations have this very strange attitude, because on one hand they are aware that Christians are very interested in Kabbalah and they would like to teach Christians Kabbalah as they were doing in northern Italy. On the other hand, they know that teaching Christians Kabbalah may be dangerous. And so they don't want to deal with that. So unfortunately, there's no trace left in what I've been finding, what I've found so far of Kabbalistic things. We found some Kabbalistic or mystical hints in homiletic works, mostly from Spain, which were copied in 15th century Puglia. But I think it's reference material.
Then, one more question. In 1590, Abraham Cohen de Herrera was studying Kabbalah in Dubrovnik. Ragusa.
Ragusa.
I think it's so close to this area that you talked about. There is any contact between those
That's a good point. I mean, for the 15th century, there's a lot of contacts, of course, because Dubrovnik was more or less related to Venice, and the coast of Apulia was under the protection of Venice, and this was the reason why many people, even in the period of harsh conflicts between Spaniards and French, like Isaac Abravanel, for instance, at the beginning of the 16th century, decided to stay in the Apulian seashore cities because they were related to Venice. Okay? And we have a lot of documents stating that Jewish merchants from Ragusa were in Lecce, or goldsmiths, Jewish goldsmiths from Ragusa were hired by the Prince of Taranto to do something in Bari, and so on and so forth. So, for sure. But in the for the end of the 16th century, unfortunately, theoretically, I mean, basically, the Jewish presence in southern Italy was no longer extant. So, I guess there still were contacts, but they, to my knowledge, not yet. Yeah.
It's important that for the time, after Jews had been expelled from Naples in 1540, the contacts were between Dubrovnik and those ports in the area of
Ancona,
Pescara, Ancona,
yeah,
especially.
yeah.
Many important.
Yeah, you have people like Amatus Lusitanus, or people who were moving between Ferrara, Ancona, and Dubrovnik, and Spalato, and for sure.
More questions?
I would like to know, Fabrizio, how are these texts, I mean the medical texts, are they known within the science in general? Or, I mean, how do you approach that? Because, we always, for example, recently I'm working with a workshop of translators from Hebrew to Spanish. So we had a text from 13th century from Spain, and there was a passage, really, one chapter, but it's a text, Ben Amelech Be'anazir, but then it's one chapter about medical knowledge. So, for example, when I was reading the Sephardic version, no source was there, no sources, just the knowledge, because it's important to prevent against the plague, blah, blah, blah. So when I was reading the 13, they were reading, my colleagues in Hebrew, the sources were there, not always, but it was a very different situation, like in my text from 19th century, of course. So my question is, how can one who doesn't have medical knowledge, like a philologist of Hebrew, can you manage it around?
Today?
With this manuscript.
Again, this is a big problem, a major problem, because when you deal with these kind of libraries, theoretically you should be familiar with this production. To my knowledge, I must say that the dealing with medieval circulation of scientific texts is it's not very difficult, because more or less they were dealing with the same texts. It's always the same texts. They might be more knowledgeable about a specific list of prescriptions or medical recipes which was based on something local, but for what concerned the most important encyclopedias, it's an encyclopedic knowledge. And most of it is related to Spain, to the Iberian Peninsula, through different passages, but it's mostly what I guess Sephardi scholars in previous generations, in the early Middle Ages, were familiar with. So they were just handing down from generation to generation this more or less the same materials. But while living in Montpellier, while living in other centers of medical knowledge, they were acquiring new texts. So, for instance, what interests me is that along with Aburkasis, for instance, which is very old prose, they were turning into Hebrew Bernard de Gordon, for instance, which was very popular in Montpellier in this period still, although it dated to the 14th century, for instance, So, and most of those translations, most of those copies of the Hebrew manuscripts had the same texts.
Okay. So that's good for you.
It's very easy.
Yeah,
it's very easy, because more or less, and it allows you to identify the source in a way. Not only the medical source, but also the geographical origin of the text. Because you see, for instance, the Ibn Shoham family copy Bernard de Gordon. And then you find that Abraham de Balmes copies the same text of Bernard
so you
de
can
Gordon.
follow, that's very useful.
It's very easy to
follow
the tradition. And you have the feeling that they were just discussing those texts in the same environment, in the same milieu.
Thank you. It's amazing. You're so lucky to have such a material. And there is a whole movement there.
But there's much more, because, for instance, if you look at the text copied by David Ibn Shoham and kept in Vienna, the one with the beautiful illuminations, there are lots of lists written in Hebrew characters, but showing Italian prescriptions. So Italian medical prescriptions, which are written, in Hebrew characters, but belie the local Salento dialect.
And you can have worked in
Yes,
Norway? Wow,
so it's
amazing.
interesting, even from the point of view of the history of the Italian language. It's very interesting because those people were familiar with the Italian language because they had to communicate with local people in the Italian language. So they had to be familiar with Italian, they had to be familiar with Latin, they had to be familiar with Hebrew, they had to be familiar with lots of languages. You know? So it's very interesting.
No, yeah. But these texts, are they edited? I mean, could you... No, that's the problem, because linguistically that's very difficult to do.
But on the other hand, we have the manuscript available, because now most of these, especially the illuminated manuscripts, are available online.
Great.
So it's very easy for us, because we can concentrate, focus on the marginal notes, for instance, medical marginal notes in this manuscript, for instance. We make a list of those texts and we see that they are in Italian, though written in Hebrew characters, and then we start them from the point of view of the history of Italian language. You know, it's very interesting.
I have a few questions. It is interesting the research you are doing, and I think that because southern Italy Jewry in the 15th century has gone unnoticed within the Mediterranean let's say, picture of late medieval Jewish societies. The focus is more either on northern Italy, Rome, and Sicily, especially Sicily.
Sicily, yeah, because we have more material.
And from the point of view of Spain, what is interesting to me is to see, because I have been collecting over the years news about all kinds of Jewish Iberian intellectuals, mostly Catalan, established in southern Italy, in Bitonto.
Yeah, exactly. Bitonto is one of the schools.
So that would be very interesting to make a whole regional study, combining both local sources, material records, and Hebrew manuscripts.
Absolutely.
The case you presented about Lecce is interesting to me because we have been, together with a student, we studied a few years ago several manuscripts, Medicine, Avicenna, but also some biblical commentaries being copied by the same person or by two different persons in one specific village in northern Castilian, what is called Tierra de Campos. And you see the mobility, the high mobility of the dynamics of the mobility of people in this area, in these small villages, that we don't know anything but for these manuscripts that are located in the Vatican, St. Petersburg, Munich, or Paris, that were copied in very small villages. And Jews stayed there for just maybe 1 year, 2 years. They were receive a salary from the local councils to be physicians, local physicians, as part of the medicalization of Western society in the 15th century. So that would be interesting to stress this network of not communities. I wouldn't call that communities. I would call more big families of people. And the situation in the Salento and the Apulia
is very similar
to Spain, even more than Sicily, because Sicily was, it's more Arabic kind of community. And so what it is interesting also to see is that all these individuals, they started the same trouble even through Montpellier. And when I didn't know that Bonafus Astruc Bonfils, this one, the translator of the Consolation by Boetius, he converted. Because to me,
a lot of documents
his case is very similar to Profia Duran.
Absolutely.
Profia Duran was also in Perpignan, converted to
the same story.
Went to Montpellier. He stayed in Barcelona and in Spain, in Navarra, and then he went to Italy, and I found him in Italy, in Pisa, in 1404. with a Christian name, with his Christian name.
Yeah, and in the school of Bitonto, I don't want to interrupt you, but just because otherwise I will forget, but the so-called school of Bitonto, about which we have this very interesting exchange of letters with Crescas Meyer, he quotes a lot of Catalan people who mostly converted or did not convert, so he wants to, that's very interesting. That's really very interesting.
But what I find interesting, and I didn't notice until now, because you show more examples of more people doing the same thing, is that while some people established in Toscana, I'm thinking of the Sforno family, another Catalan family, who became a very Italian family in the 16th century. But a second group they established in the southeast of Italy.
Yeah.
Not in Sicily, not in the west, in southwest Italy, but in
Apulia,
southeast. And this is very interesting to me. It may have to do with the feudal, with the aristocracy system. They're very similar.
And the protection of
the
Venice.
protection of some landlords.
And Venice as well.
But
because
I didn't. So you mentioned the fact that they left around 1500. They left Puglia. Some
Not all of them, but most of them, yeah.
But I would assume that they would have gone to the eastern shore of the Adriatic and the Ottoman Empire, Bellona, for instance. Bellona was full when Abravanel arrived there. There were about 200 families of Spanish Jews.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you think of David Messer-Leon...
What happened that Jews left before they were expelled from the Kingdom of Naples in 1540? Because you say that they left in 1490, but there was no expulsion at all.
Yeah, but you remember there was a major source of distress, what I'd like to call it distress, in 1495, because of the invasion of the French of the Kingdom of Naples. In 1495, as you may remember, Charles VIII came to Naples in order to conquer the kingdom, because it was assuming they belonged to them and so on. And so the king of Aragon, the Aragon king of Naples, escaped to Sicily, and Abravanel went with him to Sicily. And the situation all over the kingdom of Naples went hysterical and crazy, as is seen in Lecce, for instance, where immediately in the aftermath of the conquest of the capital city, the Jewish population the Jewish neighborhood of Lecce was sacked, and the Jewish population was obliged to take shelter. No, by the local population. The French hadn't arrived there. But the population heard about rumors in the capital, and they knew that French were against the Jews. And so they immediately took the opportunity, they seized the opportunity to react against the Jewish moneylenders and so on and so forth. And they obliged them to either to escape or to take shelter in the castle of Lecce, where many of them were killed. And the situation, theoretically, the situation was re-established by the king's guards in the following days. And Jews were immediately able to go back to their homes and so on and so forth. But they felt the risk, and many of them decided to leave. Many of them. They felt that, you know what happened between 1495 and the actual conquest of the kingdom by the Spaniards in 1502-03. The situation of Jews in southern Italy was not very safe. So the only thing Jews could do, is to take shelter in seaports under the control of Venice. Because there, like Abravanel did, like he was in Monopoly, in Barletta, and so on and so forth, because there the Venetian governor would prevent people from reacting against opposing Jews. Okay, but when at a certain point the situation even then was dangerous, and so the only opportunity for them was either to go to Venice, which was very difficult. You know that Venice didn't allow Jewish people to live in the capital city, except for very few individuals until a very late date, until 1509, 1510, Whereas Jews were allowed to stay in the colonies, in the sea colonies. So, for instance, one of the safest places to stay was Corfu, because Corfu belonged to Venice, but it was very close to Apulia. So, for instance, I found this Ibn Shoham family in Corfu. And from a certain time on, they're called from Corfu. David of Corfu, the same David ben Elia is called David of Corfu. And so this is very interesting because they were going where they were accepted, they were welcomed somehow. On the other hand, if they had nothing to do, they couldn't trade, they couldn't do anything. What was their purpose? I mean, they couldn't do anything.
Do we have numbers of, because I'm thinking more, I mean, these were very unstable communities, if at all they were communities, because I'm thinking of families, of big families set in them, but do we have numbers in documents of...
the only numbers we
fiscal,
have...
taxation...
Yeah, we have some numbers provided by Colafemmina and the scholars who've been working on archival documents, and they are relatively large numbers, like in the range of thousands in the Kingdom of Naples. I mean in the peninsular Kingdom of Naples. But so meaning that there were relatively large communities, and so one of the questions that we raised whether most of the Jews left or they just converted. And I guess that many of them converted. Because, and this is also very strange to my understanding, we still have at the beginning of the 17th century cases of priests in Puglia that preach, convey sermons to their Catholic audiences in which they say, we have to beware, we have to be able to warn you against these Jews who still live among you. How possibly? I mean, they couldn't stay. I mean, it was impossible for them to stay. And there are some small cities in Puglia where they create sorts of ghettos. At the beginning of the 17th century, which is unlikely, because according to law, Jews could not stay there. So who were they? So my point is that they probably were converts who kept intermarrying within the community of converts, as happened everywhere else for generations. But we don't have documents. We only have these sermons and these traditions.
Okay. It's evident that even Shoham, the name, I mean, it's not an even, it should be even Shoham.
That's, and you have all this 19th and 19th century tradition, even Shoham doesn't make sense in my opinion.
Yeah. So, back to the first of your slides around the Balmes
certificate
license. This is a license or this is a conferral of doctoral
It's a
degree?
It's a conferral of doctoral degree.
Thinking, how many do we know more documents like this one? I'm asking because many years ago, I don't know if he was Italian or Yugoslav scholar by the name Ladislao Münster. He published the text of the doctoral degree of David de Bakesh in Naples in 1488. David Bakesh, it was a Spanish Jew who, before the expulsion, he was in Naples and he got his doctoral degree there at the university. The documents had been copied by Münster before the war, Second World War, but since the archives in Naples were burned in 44, 43, 44, this document, among many others, was destroyed, but we still have the text. And I think that this David Bakesh is the same one we find in Guadalajara as a physician in 1491, because there was a connection between, there is a strong connection between Guadalajara and southern Italy and the Kingdom of Naples. Through that's the case of court Jews, and the nobility who was at Guadalajara was under control of the family Mendoza, and was very much connected to southern Italy. But I was just asking if there was any other document, doctoral document conferred to a Jew by the, because Jews were not allowed to study at universities in Spain, neither in Castile nor in Aragon during the Middle Ages. So, I mean, for me to see a Spanish Jew getting his doctoral degree from Naples, that was really very interesting. Another thing you mentioned, Melamed, because Melamed is also a family surname in Castile in the 15th century, a very powerful family, but this is very usual. Have you tried to put together the data from external documents, Christian documents and Hebrew manuscripts, to cross the information that you find from both sides? Have you ever tried to do that?
So, what shall I start? I mean, I have to answer very many questions.
And last one.
Yeah.
I don't know if I don't know from, I mean, Colafemi now, La Cerenza have been working on archival material in southern Italy. But I wonder if they found, or you found fragments, as our friend Perani has found in many libraries in central or northern Italy. Is there such a case in southern Italy that you still have manuscript fragments in the bindings of notarial protocols or something like that?
No, there are some. There are some. Some have been found in monastery libraries, for instance, in southern Italy, something. But compared to northern Italy,
Salento area, no.
Not to my knowledge. I haven't found anything in Colafemina either, to my knowledge. Nothing comparable to northern Italy, of course. But this it's obvious, because the problem for northern Italy is related to the confiscation edicts and the burning of the Talmud and all sorts of things which took place in mid-16th century in northern Italy. But in the mid-16th century, Jews were not allowed to stay any longer. So I guess that they didn't have libraries to sack and to use for rebinding archival material in northern Italy. So it's just a question of periods, you know. Although there are some very few cases of fragments used to rebind books in the 16th or 17th century. Yeah. You were asking about, yes, collating data of Christian documents and what Hebrew manuscripts.
Data, biographical data, you find
You know, I'm not an historian, so I'm mostly dealing with I'm mostly dealing with manuscripts and literary material. So I'm not working personally, and I'm not working in archives. So I'm waiting for historians to support me with their data. So, for instance, all the available material on Azaria Bonfil was provided to me thanks to Josef Hacker, for instance, who directed me to researches carried out in Provençal archives in the late 20th century, and so on and so forth. So I'm reading those texts. I mean, I'm reading those secondary sources, but I'm not doing them myself. So this is an interesting thing. Although, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, for the reasons you just mentioned, that the archives in Naples do not provide much materials because much has been burnt in the Second World War. And what had been copied before and rescued before has been mostly edited and published by Colafemmina, more or less. So I doubt there still is much to discover. Still, there still is something from church archives, local church archives related to agreements, contracts between Jewish people living in Lecce at the beginning of the 16th century, when you wouldn't expect to find something so important, but still you find some important names, like the canonymous names, the Balmest names, still at the beginning of the 16th century. So that's interesting. But sometimes it helps a lot because it gives you data which, for instance, for my research activities, allow to create a sort of genealogical trees and see who married whom, you know, who converted. So, for instance, it's very interesting to read Abraham the Balmest the Younger grammar, Mikne Avram, and his introduction, in which he complains all the time, says, I'm a poor guy, I have undergone all sorts of family distress, and you don't understand why that. I mean, and then you think, Mikne Avram. It's not Mikne Avraham. It's Mikne Avram. So the hey is missing. Why is it? Why does he choose Mikne Avram as the title? So why the H is missing? For Kabbalistic reasons, because the H, you know, is related to fertility, you know. So the reason why Avram will beget Yitzhak is that he gets a further hay into his name. But this is the other way around for Abraham, because he had this H, but he lost it because he lost his children. Why did he lose his children? Either they converted or they died. So he sort of explains that moving from the Kingdom of Naples to Venice after 1495 and probably 1510, when he definitely left southern Italy, he left what he had behind. So all of his family was left behind, if he had something behind. And he was too old to create a new family in Venice. And this is the reason why Mikne Avram, because he doesn't have anything left. See? So it's very sad. If you compare, and then thinking that his father, and this we know from Christian documents, that his father converted to Christianity. So imagine, his father converted, his children converted. He's the only one who didn't. And he moves to Venice, and he belongs to this very important elite of Jewish scholars working for Bomberg, you know, and he wants to leave a legacy, Mikne Aram. So it's a legacy of a person who doesn't have a legacy.
The book is the legacy.
The book is the legacy.
I
The
had
book
the same,
is the legacy.
the same rabbi without children, male
The
children.
book is the
book
legacy.
is his legacy.
So thinking of from a Jewish perspective, that if you don't have children, it's a tragic loss for Judaism. But still, you leave something which is related to Hebrew language, Hebrew grammar, Hebrew tradition, so on and so forth. So it's interesting, and in order to do so, you have to implement, to collect all extant data also. But in order to do so, now I'm working on 16th century Kabbalists from Venice, and they were also in southern Italy at some points, and I found some evidence in some autobiographic traces of their presence in southern Italy. In their autobiographical, very short notes they were writing in introductions. But in order to do so, you have to read a lot of material, and you have to hope that something is extant in some archives. Where? But you don't know. So, and you have to hope that some other scholars have been working on. It's terrible. We have to. Unfortunately, now we have a lot of data available on the internet. You know. And we have a lot of material from the 19th century scholars who did an incredibly huge work in order to assembling different sources, libraries and everything. Incredible. Still, it's big. It's a huge work. So what else? You were asking me something else?
What's the situation in Lecce? Because you selected all these manuscripts from Lecce. I have also here another one by Chris Casmail, who copied one from Parma, who copied another one in 1437.
Yeah.
But why Lecce? What's the situation there? This is the Orsini family.
Why?
That was
that's my assumption. It's not only that, but yes, the Prince of Taranto was very favorable and tolerant to Jewish presence in Lecce, so he hired a lot of people there, and they were I think the Abravanel family did the same in a way.
But the question is, Lecce was the capital,
yes, because
the center of the seigneurial state.
Yes, it became, this is also very interesting for the history of Lecce itself, because Lecce is a very specific case from an urban history of a city which was very powerful in the Roman period, and then during the early Middle Ages it's almost nothing. It's a very small village, and then in the 15th century it becomes a very important city. Why? Because of the impact of a feudal family who decided to increase the economy, to hire people, to develop the population. And so, for instance, we know that at the beginning of the 15th century, the Balzo family were inviting people from the Dalmatian coast to come to the Italian coast. Why? Because of plague. Again, because they had a lot of epidemics, and the population had been stricken and smitten with plague, and so it was very poor. And so they were renovating, redeveloping the population and this is very interesting because this is all over Apulia, all along the coast of Apulia. You have this incredibly rich development of the population through Slavic invitation of Slavic populations to come over, or Greek population to come over, and Jews were invited too from the.
Yeah, because it's such a mixed area.
It's a mixed area,
and it's the sea and everything.
So, for instance, this is something I presented in Los Angeles when I was there last month. I'm working presently with a very interesting poem, which is an Italian poem, which was written in the Salento area at the very end of the 15th century. And it's a praise of the last Aragon queen in Naples, of course, the Queen of Naples, who belonged to a branch of the Sbalzo family. Her name was Isabella del Balzo. There are very many Isabella del Balzo, so this was one of the many, Isabella del Balzo. So she was from the Andrea branch of the family, and the poem relates the journey that Isabella del Balzo does from Andria, his native city, to Lecce, and then back to Naples after her husband won the French. In 1497, the French are eventually won and sent back to France, and Ferrante, Isabella's husband, is officially king of Naples, and he will be the last of the Aragon kings of Naples. And so she's the official queen of Naples, and she knows about that when she's in Lecce, and so the whole population of Lecce feasts this. So this is the story, and it's in Ottava Rima poem, which was very popular at the time. The reason why I'm interested is that the author describes the society of Apulia at the moment. And so there are parts of the poem which are in French, and parts of the poems which are in Dalmatian.
Oh, wow.
So I think it's one of the oldest written Dalmatian poems in a very strange Slavic in Italian characters. You can imagine, very strange. But it's if you know Serbian, for instance, you understand what it's written there. Why? Because at a certain point in a city, I think it's in Acquaviva nearby, the Queen of Naples is feasted by this population of Slavic origin that performs in front of her a specific dance, which is a Dalmatian dance, and they salute her in Slavic.
This is what we know to do.
Unbelievable. And then there is a guy whose name is Solomon, who's from France, probably from Provence, who is a doctor, who is in Molfetta, and we know from Solomon Orgeri from Provence, who was the doctor and coming from a very important family of Hebrew translators from the Middle Ages and so on and so forth, who was in Molfetta exactly that one. So, and he salutes Queen Isabella in French. And it's very strange thing.
Have you published already some of it?
No, I'm dealing with that right now. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. Because he plays with French who have been kicked off the country by Isabella's husband, but Solomon is French, he doesn't want to be kicked off the country because he can provide help, but he plays with words, very strange, very, very strange. So maybe he was Jewish, and who knows? So it's very, for me this is very strange, because coming from the north, from northern Italy, and being in Lecce, for me this is so strange, so weird, that you experience a population which is monocultural nowadays. All of them are Catholic, all of them believe that their society is very Italian standard society. You know, there's nothing coming from the east, there's nothing coming from the west, people have always been there. And then you look at documents from the 15th century, and it's like a mixture of people coming from Dalmatia, Greece, and Northern Africa, and the Jews, and the Greek Orthodox, and these and that. It's totally different. Totally different. So interesting.
So you have, no, it's just a comment, you have two Ferrari Saladin.
Oh, this I'd like to know more. Yeah. If you can send me material on this Ferrer, Saladin, or whatever.
There were two different
people
with the same name, living at the same time. And one of them, we know he passed an exam for physician, medical exam.
Where?
That was in Falset in Catalonia in the late 14th century, 1395. His father was also his name was Ferrer ben Judah Levi Saladin. Ferrer Saladin was the Christian name. The Jewish name was Zerachia ben Yaakov ben Judah Levi.
But it absolutely makes sense because you have Prophet Duran, you have this Azariah Bonfil, and you have this one. I mean, all of them originally came from Catalonia, converted, something happened, and then you find them in Italy. That's very interesting. It would be very much interesting to prove that.
Yeah,
that's the same guy.
Make a link between Catalonia
and it matches. I mean, even dates are matching because it's exactly the same period.
Because one of them, we know he was the rabbi in Zaragoza in the early 15th century. We don't know what happened with him after 1415. The other one, the physician, we didn't know after that about him anything. And he was a friend of a Strugri monk who converted under the name Frances de San Jordi. So this is the same circle.
And you've written an article, or you have several?
No, I have the information collected. Because I collected the information on this rabbi, and I found another guy with the same name living at the same time. Because the rabbi that was probably also a physician, he was a very important rabbi, one of the main rabbis in Catalonia, in Aragon, Catalonia in the early 15th century. After Hazai Crescas, he became the rabbi of Zaragoza. After Hazai Crescas passed away, around 49, he became the rabbi of Zaragoza. But we don't know much about himself in Zaragoza, though we know that there were mass conversions in Zaragoza in 1440. But we don't know after that what happened with him. I don't have any information. He participated in the Tortosa disputation.
Yeah, okay.
But after the Tortosa disputation, there is no. I wasn't able to find any information about him.
So
very good. So there will be
amazing.
a next chapter.
Next chapter. Yeah, amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, because I learned a lot.
Oh, we learned.
As usual.